Hey everyone, in this video, I'll show you how to animate this clock icon. There's a link to the source file in the video description if you'd like to follow along. You can either download the file or use the open in Rive button if you just want to get in the file, poke around, check out the state machine or anything like that. So with that being said, let's hop into it. Okay, so here's our clock, and let's start by actually taking a look at the hierarchy, see how things are set up, and then we'll jump into the animation portion. So as always, I have my asset here set up with a root group, so in case we need to make any changes after we've done the animation, we can use that root group to make those changes. And then I've got my clock group, which has all the different shapes that make up the clock itself. Now, just looking through those really quickly, we've got an ellipse that creates the base of the clock. We've got two ellipses that make the bell at the top, and if you open that up, you can see that I've created an ellipse and then duplicated it and drug the other path into the shape layer, and that way I can control both of the ellipses fill at the same time. And I've also changed the origin of that shape so that I can animate the rotation of that bell and get both of those ellipses moving at the same time. Now I also have the minute hand and hour hand. Now they're the same shape. This one I've just scaled down a bit, and the way I created that was I just drug out a rectangle, converted it to a custom path, and then rounded the corners. And once my corners are rounded, I just took the top two vertices and moved it in like so. Now you can see once I move those top vertices in, the corner radius here gets a little messed up. So I can just select those and move that value down until we have that nice rounded top, just like so. And then, like I said, duplicated it, shrunk it down a little bit, and then I created my hour hand. Now, what I've done with all of the different pieces here is I've made sure to set their origin to the center of the artboard, which is also the center of the base ellipse here, because when I rotate the minute hand, I don't want the end of this minute hand getting closer or farther away from the side of the clock base. I just want it to stay the same spacing all the way around. So that's why I've changed the origin there. Okay, so I think we've looked at everything here in the hierarchy. So we can go ahead and jump into animate mode and create this clock animation. Okay, so here we are in animate mode, and what we're going to do for this animation is start by animating the minute hand and have it do a complete rotation around the clock, and then once it gets back up to the top, we'll have the clock leap into the air and do a ringing animation as if an alarm's going off. So let's start with the minute hand, and at the beginning of the timeline, we'll just go ahead and key the initial rotation. And then at 30F, so halfway down the timeline here, we're going to set a key for a complete rotation. So 360 degrees. I'm just type that into the rotation box there. And let's take a look at that. So as you can see, our minute hand is rotating around. I'm going to go ahead and set this to a looping animation so we can preview it a little bit easier. Now, the motion of the minute hand is a little boring because it's moving at the same rate the entire time. So I'm going to go ahead and give the first key here cubic easing, and that's already going to make it look a little bit better. But I want the minute hand to slowly start the animation, so I'll give it a little bit more ease in. Actually, I'm just going to give it as much ease in as I can, and then maybe just a little bit of ease out so that it slowly starts the animation, is very explosive, and then sort of eases out of it. So let's check that out. Okay, that looks all right. I'm gonna give it a little bit more time here to complete its rotation. So I'm gonna give it an extra 10 milliseconds. So just scoot it from 30 to 40. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so I really like the motion of this. So now what we can do is use the minute hand here to inform us of the timing of the jump. So we want the jump to start right as it's getting to the top. So I would say 35 is probably close enough. So what we're going to do is animate the Y motion of the clock group. Now, you can do this two ways. You can either start with the Y motion or start with the squashing and stretching. Personally, I like to go with the Y motion because then it makes the squash and stretch a lot easier to figure out. So 35F is where the leaping is going to start. So at 35, I'm going to key the initial Y position. And then we need to figure out how long it's going to take to get in the air. I'm going to go ahead and go with 15 milliseconds. Put it at its highest point here. Make sure I didn't create an X key. I did. So I'm going to delete that because we don't need it. Okay. And then it needs to hang in the air for a little bit of time. Now, we've basically run out of room on the timeline. So I'm going to give myself an extra second. And it took 15 milliseconds to get into the air. And let's give it, let's see, that's 10, 20. Let's give it 30 milliseconds to get back down to the ground. Like that. Okay, so let's add cubic easing to these Y keys and then adjust the timing and easing until we're happy with the Y motion. Okay, so it's taking too long to get in the air, but what we can do is go ahead and just give it more explosive curve so that it quickly pops into the air, and then we want it to hang out here before coming down, so I'm going to give it as much ease into the next key as I can. And these are usually the curves that I use for a jump. It's just going to depend, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so I like that. Now I can probably just take this this jumping motion and scoot it back just a little bit, and I'll show you why. The minute hand, there's going to be two things that are creating sort of the anticipation for the jump. The minute hand, and then when we add the squash and stretch. Now, the reason I scooted it back more is that I actually want that minute hand to almost push it into the air. Now it's coming into this a little bit too slow, so I'm going to take out some of the ease in or ease out of my minute hand key. Okay, that's happening a little too fast now, or happening a little too early. So let me scoot it forward. Okay, let's see that. Okay, so as I said, I'm trying to use that minute hand to almost fling it into the air. So that's why I was just trying to adjust my timing there a little bit, because that minute hand, as I said, makes for good anticipation for the leaping. Okay, so let's add in some squash and stretch to make this leap a little bit better here. So I'm going to grab the clock group. And we want the squash to start before our leaping. So where did we move this to? 34. I'm actually going to move it ahead to 35 so that it's a little bit easier to time. And now we can actually have the squash start before the leaping. So I'm going to use 10 milliseconds. So at 25F, so 10 milliseconds before the leaping starts, I'm going to go ahead and set my initial scale and then go to the key where it's actually going to leap off the ground and squash it down like this. Now what I've done with the squash is I'm trying to keep in mind the volume of the clock. So I've stretched it out 10% in the X, so I want to squash it down 10% in the Y. And that's just going to make it a little more believable, because if you start letting your volume get a little out of whack, it may become noticeable. So that's why I've set the specific values that I did. Now, when it leaps into the air, we want it to stretch because it's moving quite quickly. So I'm going to use the exact same values. I'm just going to invert them. So we've gone 90 in the X, and we're going to go 110 in the Y. All right. So there, It's going to stretch. Then it needs to come back to its original scale. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab that initial scale value and paste it here, because it needs to go back to the original scale after it's gotten to the top of the jump. So let's go ahead and add cubic interpolation to our scale keys here and start adjusting their timing and that easing until we're happy with it. Okay, so I don't think it's going into this stretch motion quick enough, so I'm just going to give it a little more explosive of curve. That looks good. And then maybe we want it to go into its normal scale a little bit slower. Let's see that. Okay, so I actually like the initial squash and stretch that we have here. Now we need to squash it and stretch it, or squash it one more time when it hits the ground to make this ending motion a little bit more interesting. So let's say it stays at the same scale until here, and then it looks like it hits the ground about right here. So let's go ahead and squash it. Now what I'm going to do with the squash is just squash it a little bit less than the initial squash. So I'm only going to go 5% in the X, and let's go 5% in the Y, and then back to its normal scale. Okay, give those cubic easing, and let's take a look at that. Okay, so that's nice. That last squash is just, it's subtle, but it helps the landing motion. Okay, so now that we have the jump and we've got its squash and stretch added, let's go ahead and add in the ringing animation. So where do we want it to start ringing? I think we want it to ring right as it start ringing right when it jumps into the air. So let's set our initial rotation key here on the bell, because this is what's actually going to be moving back and forth. And we're just going to use rotation for this. So so we've got our initial key set. Now, I'm not sure the timing on it, so I'm just going to use 5 milliseconds to start with. So we've got our initial rotation key set at 35. I'm going to go to 40, and let's rotate it 5 degrees. So I'm going to start with 5 degrees to the right, and then we'll go 5 milliseconds forward, and let's go to -5. So it's rotating the same amount past 0 in both directions. So 5 to the right and then 5 to the left. And let's take this this second rotation key here, so the 5 degrees, copy it, paste it at 50F. And now what we've done is we've got our initial scale key, then we've got 5 to the right, 5 to the left, and 5 back to the right. So these 3 keys here make a loop. So what we're going to do is take this loop, copy it, and paste it all the way until we get back down to the grounds, like here. Now let's set a 0 rotation key for the last rotation here. So I've changed the value of this from either 5 or -5. I don't remember what it was. So it was 5. I just changed that to 0 to sort of bring it back to where it needs to be. So let me give all these rotation keys here cubic interpolation, and let's look at the animation and make our adjustments. Okay, so the ringing is happening too slow. So instead of trying to scoot all of our keys into the right timing, what I'm going to do is delete out all the keys that we copy and pasted in, and that leaves us with our initial key and then that first loop. So now we can just use these 3 keys here to set the timing, and then go ahead and copy and paste those again. So instead of using 5 milliseconds, I'm going to drop it down to 2. So I've gone from 35 to 37. We need to go to 39 to put this next key, and then 41 for the last one. So we've got our loop here, and these are all spread out 2 milliseconds. So I'm just going to copy that new loop and paste it, and continue pasting it until it's back to where we want it. Now this is probably good right here, because that's our initial scale, and it's going to squash So I'm going to go ahead and set a 0 key right here. And let's take a look at that and see if we're happy with it. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now, the ringing itself looks all right, but it doesn't quite look as good as it could. So what I'm going to do is add in a little bit of extra rotation on the clock group to just sort of accent the bell's rotation. So using the bell rotation as a guide, I'm going to add in rotation on the clock group. So at the initial position here of the bell, we're going to add in that 0 rotation key, go forward 2 keys, or 2 milliseconds, and add in some rotation here. So it initially goes to the right, so we need to add in a positive value. I'm not going to go with 5 degrees. I'm going to make it a little bit less just because it's more of an accent. And then we'll go -3 so that it's going to the right. And then back to +3. Now we've got that loop. We just take those, copy and paste them, and this should keep the exact same timing, just like that. And then don't forget to change the last rotation key from 3 to 0, and then give everything that cubic interpolation. Now let's take a look at this and see if we need to make any more adjustments. Okay, I'm actually pretty happy with the animation itself. So let's go ahead and add in a new animation. Before we do that, I need to rename this one. So instead of animation 1, I'm going to call it hover. And let's add in a new animation, and we need to make an idle animation so that when we go into the state machine, we have an animation to start on. So let's rename this animation idle. And what we need for the idle animation is we need to have the first keys of the idle animation be the first keys of all the objects that we have keyed in the hover animation. So we've got the scale, rotation, and X of the clock. I'm just going to copy and paste those and drag them back to the beginning. First minute hand key here. And then we need the first rotation key of the bell. Just like that. Okay, so that's going to serve as our idle animation. So let's add the state machine and hook everything up. So let's drag in the idle first because we want our state machine to start here. And then we'll add the hover animation to the graph. And let's create a two-way transition between the idle and hover so that we can go back and forth. Because what this is going to be is sort of like a button on maybe like the home screen of your phone. And if you're hovering over it, I want the animation to play. And when you're not hovered over it, I don't want the animation to be playing. So we've got our idle so that the clock can just sit there. And then we've got our hover animation, which is set to a loop so that it can continuously play. Now, right now we don't have any controls to actually switch back and forth between our animations. So what we need to do is add in an input. So instead of using a trigger, which we've used a number of times before, we're going to use the Boolean. And the Boolean allows us to hold a true or false value for long periods of time. So we might want this animation or this idle animation to sit here for a while, and then we might want to sit on the hover animation for a while. So it's a good candidate for a Boolean. So let's call this Boolean hover and go ahead and apply this to our two-way transition. So from idle to hover, we want the hover animation to play when the hover Boolean is true. And we want to go back to the idle animation when our hover Boolean is false. So now when we play our animation, or when we play the state machine, you can see that it will sit there on that idle until we check the hover Boolean. And then it'll continuously play this animation. Now, one good thing that we did with the hover animation that I didn't talk about was we left ourselves a little bit extra time here at the end of the timeline, so that it's not just constantly playing the animation. There's a little bit of a gap, and then it plays it again. So there's one last problem that we want to address, and that's what happens when somebody would stop hovering the button there when it's halfway in between finishing this hover animation. You can see that it snaps back to that idle really quickly, and we don't quite want that to happen. So there's two ways we can fix this. We need to first go to the transition from the hover back to the idle, because that's where the problem is. And we could do this by adjusting the duration, which is the blending between the two animations. So right now it's set to 0, which is why it snaps. But if we increase that to, like, let's say 500 milliseconds, you can see that it's going to try to blend the two animations together over half a second. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So you can see it sort of slowly goes back to that starting position. Now, the reason that the minute hand is actually making a counterclockwise rotation is, if you remember, we copied the initial rotation of the minute hand and not the second rotation key here. So it's trying to blend from 360 back to 0, and it's going counterclockwise. So to fix that, we can just take this 360 degree key here and paste it into the idle animation. So now, instead of being at 0 degrees, it's at 360, which looks the same, but it'll fix this problem that we have. So you can see that it still sort of shakes and then slowly goes down. So it's probably not the best way to fix this. The other way we can do it, let me just go ahead and remove this duration, is to use exit time. Now, exit time will tell this animation how much of it needs to play before it can switch back to idle. So right now it's at 0. You can use milliseconds or percent. So what I want to happen is I want this entire hover animation to play. So I'm going to just put in 100% before going back to idle. So now it doesn't matter at any point when that hover animation is unchecked. It'll make sure that the entire hover animation plays and then goes back to idle. So that's fixed our problem. So that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please go ahead and leave a comment on the video, and I'll try to address those as quickly as possible. If you do follow along with this, make sure you post it on the community, because I'd like to see what you're working on, and I'll drop by and leave you a comment and try and help you out. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.